My name is Danielle, and I am 34 years old. On the same morning my company laid me off after 9 years of loyal service, my husband filed for divorce before I had even taken off my badge. What he didn't know was that 6 hours earlier, I had signed away my startup for $14 million. Before I continue this story, let me know in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever had to smile through humiliation while quietly holding all the power, hit like and subscribe, because you are going to enjoy this one. It was a gray Thursday in early March, the kind of flat, colorless morning that gives Chicago no reason to be beautiful. I sat at my desk on the 14th floor of Holbrook Logistics, watching rain streak sideways across the windows, when my calendar pinged with a meeting titled simply, Restructuring Discussion. I am, by nature and training, a person who reads patterns for a living. As the director of supply chain analytics, I had spent 9 years building the models that kept 40 distribution centers running on time and under budget. I did not panic when I saw that invite. I told myself it was routine. I have built my entire adult life on the belief that if you are useful enough, if your numbers are clean enough, you are safe. That belief was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. What almost nobody at Holbrook knew, not even my closest colleagues, was that 5 years earlier, on nights and weekends, I had co-founded a small software company with my college roommate, Priya. We built a routing optimization platform for regional trucking fleets, the unglamorous kind of software that nobody posts about on social media but that quietly saves companies millions of dollars a year in fuel and idle time. I kept it separate from my day job on purpose. I kept it separate from my marriage for reasons I would only fully understand by the end of that day. That morning, while I sat waiting for a restructuring meeting I did not yet know was about to end my career, my phone buzzed with a message from Priya. The acquisition is closing today. Wire transfer confirmed for 2 p.m. I remember staring at that message and feeling nothing close to triumph, only a strange, hollow disbelief, the kind of numbness that comes right before something enormous. At 11:15, I walked into a small glass conference room and sat across from my VP of Operations, a man named Grant Halsey, and a woman from HR I had spoken to maybe twice in 9 years. Grant did not make eye contact. He talked about market headwinds and headcount optimization and a severance package that would be, in his words, generous. I nodded. I did not cry. I asked exactly 3 questions, all of them about timelines and paperwork, because that is what 9 years of pattern recognition teaches you to do when the ground disappears beneath you. You keep your voice level. You collect the data. You do not give anyone the satisfaction of watching you break. I walked out of that building at 11:47 in the morning holding a cardboard box that contained a desk plant, 2 picture frames, and absolutely nothing else that mattered. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 11 minutes before I could make my hands stop shaking enough to drive. And then, at 2 o'clock that same afternoon, sitting in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the office that no longer employed me, I watched my banking app refresh, and a number appeared that did not feel real. $14,112,000, landing in an account my husband did not know existed. I should have felt something enormous in that moment. Instead I felt strangely calm, the way you feel in the eye of a storm you haven't realized has only just begun. I drove home through the rain with the box of desk photos on the passenger seat, rehearsing in my head how I would tell my husband, Marcus, both pieces of news at once. I lost my job today. And also, I am now a multimillionaire. I imagined his face. I imagined pride, maybe worry, maybe both. I did not imagine what was actually waiting for me on the kitchen counter when I walked through my own front door. A thick cream envelope, sitting perfectly centered on the granite island, my name typed across the front in a font too formal for anything good. I set down the cardboard box. I opened the envelope with hands that had finally stopped shaking, only to start again. Inside was a petition for dissolution of marriage, filed that morning, timestamped 9:52 a.m., 2 hours and 8 minutes after I had walked into that glass conference room and lost my job. Marcus was not even home to hand it to me himself. He had left it on the counter like a utility bill and gone to the gym. I read the petition twice, standing perfectly still in my own kitchen, water still dripping off my coat onto the hardwood floor. The language was clinical, cold, drafted by a lawyer with a downtown address I recognized from billboards on the expressway, the kind of firm that specializes in protecting men who see marriage as an asset to be managed rather than a life to be shared. Irreconcilable differences, it read. Petitioner requests primary possession of the marital residence. Petitioner requests equitable division of all joint accounts. I noticed, with the same flat precision I once used to audit freight contracts, that Marcus had filed this petition using our accountant, a man who had access to every account I had ever shown my husband, but not the one account I had never told him about. My hand stopped shaking somewhere around the third read-through. In their place came something quieter and far more dangerous, a kind of stillness I recognized from every crisis I had ever managed at work, the moment when panic burns off and all that's left is the question of what to do next. I called my brother Ray before I called anyone else. Ray is 38, a corporate litigator who spent 6 years doing forensic asset tracing before he made partner at his firm, the kind of attorney who reads a balance sheet the way other people read a novel, looking for the one sentence that doesn't belong. He answered on the second ring, still at his office, and I could hear him set down whatever he was holding the moment I said the word divorce. I told him everything in order, flat and factual, the way you'd brief a colleague on a failed shipment. The layoff at 11. The acquisition closing at 2. The petition on the counter at 4:15. There was a long pause on the line, and then Ray said something I will never forget. Say that timeline again, slower. When I did, he went quiet in a different way, the particular silence of a man doing math in his head. Danielle, he said finally, do you understand what you just told me? Marcus filed for divorce 2 hours after you lost your job, and he has no idea what happened at 2 o'clock. That is not heartbreak. That is a man with information, acting on a schedule. I sat down at my kitchen table, the cream envelope still open in front of me, and for the first time that day I let myself ask the question that had been circling under the surface of my shock like a shark beneath calm water. How had Marcus known, that same morning, before I even knew myself, that this was the day to file? Ray asked me who else at Holbrook Logistics knew about the restructuring before it was announced. I thought about it, really thought about it, running back through months of small comments and passing conversations, and one name surfaced immediately. Grant Halsey, my VP of Operations, played golf every single Saturday with a foursome that included 2 Holbrook executives and, as I now remembered with a sick lurch in my stomach, my husband's boss at the commercial real estate fund where Marcus worked as a director. I told Ray this, and he exhaled slowly on the other end of the line, the sound of a man confirming a theory he'd already half formed. Don't confront him tonight, Ray said. Don't cry, don't scream. Don't give him a single piece of information he doesn't already have. Just come stay somewhere else for the night and let me start pulling records in the morning. If he timed this, we need proof before he knows we know. I hung up the phone and sat alone in my kitchen for a long time, listening to the rain, thinking about the $14 million sitting untouched and unmentioned in an account with my name and only my name on it. I thought about how, 3 years into our marriage, Marcus had gently suggested I add him to my personal accounts for simplicity, and how something in me, some quiet, stubborn instinct I never examined too closely, had always found a polite reason to say not yet. I used to think that instinct was paranoia. Sitting in that kitchen with a divorce petition in front of me, I understood, for the first time, that it might have been the smartest decision I ever made without knowing why I was making it. I packed a bag that night and told Marcus, through a single text message, that I needed space and would be staying with a friend. He replied within 90 seconds, a suspiciously fast response for a man supposedly heartbroken over a dissolving marriage. Take whatever time you need, he wrote. I think this is for the best, honestly. I read that message standing in my brother's guest bedroom, and I felt something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with insult. This is for the best, honestly, from a man who had married me 9 years earlier in a backyard ceremony where he cried so hard reciting his vows that the officiant had to pause twice. I did not sleep that first night. I lay on Ray's guest bed staring at the ceiling, replaying our marriage on a loop the way you replay a car accident, searching every scene for the moment it had actually ended, long before the paperwork made it official. I thought about the last 2 years, how Marcus had grown distant in ways I had explained away as work stress, how he'd started taking calls in the garage with the door shut, how he'd stopped asking about my late nights building Prius and my company because, I now realized with a bitter kind of clarity, he had genuinely never believed it would amount to anything. He used to call it my little side project, always with a small, indulgent smile, the kind you give a child's lemonade stand. I had let that smile roll off me for years because I told myself it didn't matter what he thought it was worth, only what it actually was. In the morning, Ray arrived with 2 coffees and a legal pad already half filled with handwriting. He is, in every way that matters, our father's son, though our father had been an insurance claims investigator rather than a lawyer, and Ray inherited exactly the kind of mind that treats a crisis as a puzzle rather than a wound. He sat across from me at his kitchen table and laid out what he'd found overnight, working phone calls and quiet favors from people who owed him. Marcus's real estate fund, it turned out, had lost a major institutional client 6 weeks earlier, a client whose withdrawal had triggered a performance review that put Marcus's annual bonus, nearly $400,000, at serious risk. Ray had also confirmed, through a paralegal friend at the downtown firm, that Marcus had retained divorce counsel not that week, not that month, but nearly 2 months earlier, quietly building a file while continuing to sleep beside me every night as though nothing had changed. 2 months, Ray repeated, watching my face carefully. He has been planning this for 2 months, Danielle, while you had no idea your marriage was already over. My first instinct, sitting there, was the same instinct Chelsea in every story like this one has felt before me, the pure animal urge to call him screaming, to demand answers, to make him feel even a fraction of the vertigo currently swallowing me whole. Ray must have seen it on my face because he reached across the table and closed his hand gently over mine. "Don't," he said. Rage feels like power in the moment, but it hands him a script. He wants you emotional. He wants you unstable and broke and easy to outnegotiate in mediation. Every single thing you do for the next 30 days should make you look exactly like what you are, calm, competent, and completely in control. Let him keep believing you have nothing. I nodded slowly, feeling something shift and settle inside me, the same click I used to feel at Hallbrook when a chaotic supply chain problem finally resolved into a clean, solvable model. I still had not told a single soul, not even Ray in full, about the true size of the acquisition sitting in my account. I told him now, the exact number, watching his eyebrows lift for the first time in the entire conversation. $14 million, he repeated softly, and then, after a pause, a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face, the first one either of us had managed since the previous morning. "Danielle," he said, "he filed for divorce the same day you became worth more than his entire firm manages in client assets, and he has no idea. We are not just going to win this. We are going to make sure he understands, in real time, exactly what he threw away." Over the next 10 days, I did not call Marcus. I did not text him. I responded to his lawyer's initial demands through my own attorney, a sharp, unhurried woman named Colette whom Ray had personally recommended, with brief, boring, procedurally correct silence. Nothing to see here. Just a woman quietly falling apart, exactly as scripted. Meanwhile, behind that careful stillness, Ray and Colette worked like a pair of surgeons, and I worked alongside them the only way I know how, by building a model. I have spent my entire career turning chaos into a spreadsheet, and heartbreak, it turns out, is no exception. I built a timeline, hour by hour, cross-referencing every piece of information available to us. Marcus's calendar, subpoenaed later through discovery, showed a lunch meeting with his divorce attorney on January the 9th, 61 days before he filed. It showed 3 golf outings with Grant Halsey and 2 Hallbrook Logistics board members in the weeks leading up to my layoff, outings Marcus had never once mentioned to me, though he mentioned, in exhaustive detail, every deal he'd ever closed on a golf course. It showed, most damning of all, a text exchange Colette's team uncovered through his own device, backed up automatically to a shared family cloud account he had apparently forgotten still existed, a single message sent to a woman named Sabrina, a junior associate at his firm 12 years his junior, sent the same afternoon my petition was filed. "She's getting laid off today," the message read. "Filing this morning before she finds out. Better to move first while she's distracted and has no leverage." I read that message standing in Colette's downtown office, and for the second time in 2 weeks I felt the floor genuinely tilt beneath me, not from grief this time, but from the sheer clinical coldness of it, the realization that my husband had used my career, my income, my entire professional identity, as a variable in a spreadsheet of his own, one designed purely to minimize what he would owe me. Sabrina, Colette confirmed after a quiet round of research, was not simply a colleague. Discovery would later reveal a pattern of hotel charges stretching back 8 months, disguised as client entertainment expenses on Marcus's corporate card, along with a joint gym membership at a boutique studio 20 minutes from our house, in a neighborhood where neither of us had any reason to be. I sat with that information for exactly 1 evening. I allowed myself, in the privacy of Ray's guest room, 1 single hour to cry, ugly and unrestrained, mourning not the marriage, which I now understood had been quietly dead for the better part of a year, but the version of myself who had trusted so completely that she never once checked. And then I got up, washed my face, and went back to work, because grief, I have learned, makes an excellent motivator when you finally decide to stop drowning in it and start using it. Ray had, by that point, identified our real opportunity. Under our state's equitable distribution laws, assets acquired during the marriage are typically subject to division, but assets held in a business Danielle founded independently, funded independently, and never commingled with marital accounts occupy a very different, far more defensible legal category, especially when the acquiring party can demonstrate the other spouse had no knowledge of, involvement in, or financial contribution to the enterprise whatsoever. Colette had already begun building exactly that case, pulling 5 years of bank statements showing every dollar Priya and I had ever invested in our company traced back to my personal, premarital savings and a small business loan I had taken out in my maiden name before Marcus and I had even moved in together. Marcus, in his infinite confidence, had spent 2 months building an elaborate strategy to divorce a woman he believed was about to become unemployed and financially dependent on him. He had no idea he was about to walk into a mediation room believing he held every advantage, while the woman across the table quietly held nearly 15 million reasons to smile. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Marcus left that cream envelope on our kitchen counter. Colette insisted on choosing the venue, a neutral conference room in a law office downtown, all glass walls and blonde wood, the kind of sterile, expensive space designed to make people feel civilized even while dismantling their lives. I wore a simple navy suit, no jewelry beyond my wedding ring, which I had deliberately kept on, and I arrived 4 minutes early with Colette at my side and Ray waiting in the lobby, technically uninvolved but unable, in his words, to miss this for anything short of a subpoena. Marcus arrived 6 minutes late, which told me everything about his state of mind before he even opened the door. He looked good, rested, wearing a new suit I didn't recognize, and beside him walked his attorney, a smooth, silver-haired man named Foster who had the practiced calm of someone who had never once lost a case he expected to win. Marcus glanced at me across the table and offered a small, careful smile, the kind you give someone you feel sorry for. "Danielle," he said. "You look well." I said nothing, only nodded, and let Colette open with the standard preliminaries, financial disclosures, asset review, the dry procedural language that gives every divorce its false sense of order. Foster went first, presenting Marcus's position with the smooth confidence of a man reading from a script he'd rehearsed for weeks. Given Danielle's recent job loss, he began, "My client believes a fair and reasonable settlement would include primary possession of the marital home, given his stronger current earning capacity, along with equitable division of retirement accounts and a modest transitional spousal support arrangement to help Danielle stabilize during this difficult period." I watched Marcus nod along to his own attorney's words, his expression carefully arranged into something resembling reluctant generosity, a man magnanimously offering to help his struggling, unemployed ex-wife get back on her feet. I let the silence stretch for exactly 3 seconds after Foster finished speaking, long enough that even Marcus shifted slightly in his seat. Then Colette opened the leather folder in front of her and, without a trace of drama in her voice, began to speak. Before we discuss spousal support, she said, I think it's important the room have a complete and accurate picture of my client's current financial position. She slid a single document across the table, and I watched, with a satisfaction I had been rationing carefully for 3 weeks, as Foster picked it up, scanned it, and went very, very still. It was a bank statement, dated the same afternoon the divorce petition had been filed, showing a wire transfer of $14,112,000 into an account held solely in my name. Marcus leaned over to read it upside down, and I watched the exact moment the number registered, watched the color drain from his face in real time, watched 9 years of carefully performed marriage collapse into something closer to panic. What is this? He said, his voice suddenly missing all of its earlier practiced warmth. Colette answered before I had to. This is the proceeds from the sale of a technology company Danielle co-founded 5 years ago, funded entirely through premarital assets and never commingled with any joint accounts, closing at 2 p.m. on March 4th, the same day your client filed for divorce at 9:52 that morning. Under the laws of this state, these funds are Danielle's separate property in their entirety. I watched Marcus's mouth open and close twice before any actual words emerged. You never told me, he finally managed, and there was real anger in it now, the wounded fury of a man who felt, absurdly, betrayed. I looked at him then, really looked at him, for the first time in 3 weeks, and I let my voice come out perfectly level, exactly the way my father-in-law's cold logic might have sounded, if I'd ever had one worth learning from. You filed for divorce 2 hours after I lost my job, I said, because you thought I'd have nothing and you'd have leverage. You just found out how wrong you were. The room went silent in a way that felt almost physical, the kind of silence that has weight and temperature. Foster set down the bank statement slowly, and I watched him recalculate everything in real time, a man realizing his entire strategy had been built on a foundation that no longer existed. Marcus, however, was not finished, because men like Marcus rarely surrender at the first blow. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his tie, and tried a new angle, the way I imagine he'd tried a dozen new angles across a decade of real estate negotiations that hadn't gone his way. Regardless of when it closed, he said, his voice regaining some of its earlier smoothness, that company was built during our marriage, using our shared time, our shared home as an office in the early years. I have every right to a portion of those proceeds, and frankly, Danielle, I think a judge is going to see this exactly the way I do, a spouse hiding significant assets during a marriage. I felt Colette's hand rest lightly on the table beside mine, a small, silent signal to let her handle this part, and I was grateful for it, because what I wanted to say in that moment was not something a mediation room could safely contain. Colette opened a second folder. Actually, she said, her tone still perfectly pleasant, we've anticipated that argument, and we have documentation showing every dollar invested in Danielle's company traced to premarital savings and a business loan secured under her maiden name 11 months before your wedding. We also have 5 years of consistent bank records showing zero marital funds were ever used for the business, and sworn statements from Danielle's business partner confirming Marcus had no involvement, financial or operational, in the company at any point. She paused, letting that settle, and then added, almost gently, we also have something else you should probably see before this conversation continues. She slid a second document across the table, and this time I watched Marcus's face change again, faster and uglier than before. It was a printout of the text message to Sabrina. She's getting laid off today. Filing this morning before she finds out. Better to move first while she's distracted and has no leverage. Marcus stared at it for a long moment, and then, in a voice that had lost every trace of its earlier confidence, he said the single most revealing sentence of the entire meeting. Where did you get that? Not a denial. Not an explanation. Only the panicked question of a man realizing, in real time, exactly how much rope he had handed us. Foster, to his credit, reached over and physically placed his hand over the document, sliding it toward himself, a lawyer trying to contain a fire that had already spread well beyond his control. I need a moment with my client, he said quietly, and Colette nodded, gracious in victory in a way I don't know that I could have managed myself. We stepped out into the hallway, Ray materializing from the lobby the instant the door closed, his eyebrows raised in a silent question. I nodded once, and something in my face must have told him everything, because a slow, satisfied smile spread across his face, the same one he'd worn 3 weeks earlier at his kitchen table. Colette turned to me, her expression professional but unmistakably pleased. That text message changes everything, she said. It's evidence of premeditated timing tied directly to your employment status, which strengthens both our asset protection argument and, frankly, gives us significant leverage on spousal support, given that he attempted to exploit what he believed was your financial vulnerability. Marcus isn't just going to lose the $14 million he never had a claim to. He's about to lose the house, a significant chunk of his retirement accounts, and quite possibly his job, once his firm's compliance department finds out he was using corporate credit cards to fund an affair with a subordinate 12 years his junior. I stood in that hallway, in a building I had never set foot in before that morning, and felt something unlock in my chest that I hadn't realized had been clenched shut for 3 weeks, maybe longer, maybe since the day Marcus had started calling my company his little side project with that small, indulgent smile I had let roll off me for far too long. We reconvened 20 minutes later, and the entire dynamic of the room had inverted itself. Marcus sat lower in his chair. Foster's earlier smooth confidence had curdled into something more careful, more defensive, the posture of a man trying to salvage a negotiation rather than win one. He opened by attempting to reframe the conversation entirely, suggesting that perhaps, given everything on the table, both parties might benefit from a private settlement discussion rather than continuing down what he called an adversarial path. Colette, unbothered, simply nodded and said she was happy to continue exactly as we had been proceeding, since the documentation spoke for itself. What followed was less a negotiation and more a slow, methodical dismantling, and I found myself watching it with the same detached professional focus I used to bring to a failing supply chain, identifying every point of failure, one after another, and letting the model resolve itself without needing to raise my voice even once. Colette laid out our position with surgical clarity. The $14 million remained entirely my separate property, fully protected under premarital funding documentation Ray and his team had spent 3 weeks assembling. The marital home, which Marcus had requested outright in his opening offer, would instead be sold, with proceeds split according to each party's documented financial contribution, a calculation that favored me significantly once Colette produced 5 years of mortgage statements showing I had covered the majority of the down payment from my own signing bonus at Hallbrook, a detail Marcus had apparently either forgotten or assumed I had forgotten. His retirement accounts, accumulated during the marriage, remained subject to standard equitable division, which meant I would in fact walk away with a portion of those as well, a small, almost poetic footnote given everything else on the table. And then there was the matter of spousal support, which Foster had opened the meeting requesting on Marcus's behalf. Colette addressed it last, and I watched her deliver the line with the same understated precision she'd used all morning. Given Danielle's current financial position, she said, and given the evidence we've reviewed today regarding the circumstances and timing of this filing, we believe spousal support is not only unwarranted but that the more relevant conversation is whether Marcus's employer will consider the corporate card expenditures documented here to be misuse of company funds, which is, of course, entirely separate from what happens in this room, but worth noting for the full picture. Marcus's jaw tightened visibly. He looked, for the first time all morning, less like a competent real estate director and more like a man watching a building he'd financed collapse in slow motion, each floor giving way to the one beneath it. He turned to me directly then, ignoring the lawyers entirely, and something in his expression shifted, an attempt, I think, at genuine appeal rather than legal maneuvering. "Danielle," he said, his voice quieter than it had been all morning, "can we just talk, please, just the two of us?" I looked at him for a long moment, at the man I had married in a backyard 9 years earlier, who had once cried reciting his own vows, and I thought about the message to Sabrina, "She's getting laid off today, filing this morning before she finds out," and I thought about how easily he had turned my worst possible day into a line item in his own strategic calculation. "I don't think there's anything left to talk about," I said, and I meant it in every sense the words could carry. Colette closed her folder with a soft, decisive sound, and Foster, sensing correctly that his client's position had no further ground to hold, asked for a recess to discuss terms privately with Marcus. As they gathered their papers, I caught Marcus glancing one more time at the bank statement still sitting in the center of the table, at the number that had rewritten every assumption he'd built his entire strategy on, and I realized, watching him, that this was the version of justice I actually wanted, not a screaming confrontation, not a scene, just the quiet, irreversible mathematics of consequence finally catching up to a man who had assumed I would always be the smaller number in his equation. The recess lasted nearly 2 hours. I sat in the lobby with Ray, drinking bad coffee from a machine that dispensed it lukewarm, watching the elevator doors open and close as other people's lives, other people's negotiations, passed through that building around us. Ray talked to fill the silence, telling me stories about our father, about cases he'd worked years earlier that reminded him of this one, about the particular satisfaction of watching a confident man discover, too late, that he had underestimated the person sitting across from him. I mostly listened, running the morning back through my mind in fragments, Marcus's face when he saw the bank statement, the specific stillness in the room when Colette laid down the text message, the strange, hollow relief of hearing him say we should talk, please, and realizing I felt nothing when he said it, no pull, no old loyalty, only the quiet certainty that I had already said everything I needed to say. When Foster finally emerged and asked us back into the conference room, his posture told the story before a single word was spoken. He had the careful, deflated bearing of an attorney delivering terms he knew were far worse than the ones he'd walked in hoping to secure. Marcus sat beside him, staring at a spot on the table rather than at me, and Foster laid out the revised proposal in a voice stripped of its earlier polish. Marcus would waive any claim to the acquisition proceeds entirely, acknowledging them as my separate property in writing. The marital home would be sold, with proceeds split according to documented contribution, which meant 68% to me, 32% to him. Retirement accounts would be divided according to standard formula. And Marcus would withdraw his request for spousal support entirely, a detail Foster delivered without meeting my eyes, given, he said carefully, the change in circumstances discussed this morning. Colette glanced at me, a small, silent question, and I nodded once. We accept these terms, she said, with one addition. Given the evidence of premeditated timing and the use of corporate resources potentially in violation of Marcus's employment agreement, we're prepared to keep this matter entirely between the parties in this room, provided the settlement is finalized without further delay or renegotiation. I watched something pass across Foster's face, quiet relief, the recognition of a threat wrapped inside an olive branch, an offer to let Marcus's professional reputation survive this if he simply signed and disappeared quietly. He nodded, murmured something about client instructions, and the room settled into the dry, procedural rhythm of paperwork being finalized, initials, signatures, dates. Marcus signed everything Foster slid in front of him without argument, his earlier fight completely drained out of him, replaced by the flat, exhausted compliance of a man who understood, finally and completely, that he had lost. Near the end, as Colette gathered the last of the documents, Marcus looked up at me one final time. I didn't know, he said quietly, so quietly I almost missed it. About the company. If I had known, things would have been different. I looked at him for a long moment, considering whether that sentence was even true, whether a man who had used my layoff as a strategic filing trigger would have behaved any differently had he known the real number sitting in my account, or whether he simply would have filed sooner, moved faster, tried harder to claim a piece of something he had never once believed in. I don't think that's true, I said finally, my voice even, almost gentle. I think you would have found a different reason. You just would have found it before I found out about Sabrina instead of after. He didn't answer. There was nothing left for him to say, and for the first time since that cream envelope had appeared on my kitchen counter, I felt the last, thin thread connecting me to who we had been together finally, quietly, completely sever. 6 weeks later, I stood in the atrium of a hotel downtown at Priya's company launch party, the official public unveiling of what our small routing software had become under its new owners, now rebranded and rolled out across 300 additional fleets nationwide. It was not the kind of gala the story I'd once heard from a friend of a friend had described, no orchestra, no chandeliers dripping over a stage, just good lighting, good wine, and a room full of people who had genuinely earned their place in it. I wore green, not out of any symbolism I'd planned in advance, simply because it was the dress in my closet that made me feel most like myself again, and I stood near the back for most of the evening, watching Priya field congratulations with the easy grace of someone who had always known exactly what she was building. Ray was there, of course, unable to resist attending anything that felt even loosely like a victory lap, and at some point during the evening he leaned toward me and asked, quietly, whether I'd heard anything more about Marcus since the settlement finalized. I had, actually. Word travels in small, specific circles, and mutual acquaintances had passed along fragments over the preceding weeks the way people always do when a mutual friend's life has become, unofficially, public entertainment. Marcus's firm, it turned out, had opened an internal compliance review shortly after the settlement closed, triggered not by anything Colette or I had done directly, but by an anonymous tip that reached their human resources department describing a pattern of misused corporate entertainment expenses tied to a personal relationship with a subordinate. I hadn't sent that tip. Ray swore, with a perfectly straight face, that he hadn't either, though I noticed he never quite met my eyes when he said it. Whatever its origin, the review moved quickly, and Marcus was placed on administrative leave within 2 weeks, officially for what the firm's internal memo called a violation of professional conduct policy regarding workplace relationships and expense reporting. Sabrina, I later heard, had been quietly let go as well, her promising junior broker career derailed before it ever fully began, a footnote in a story she had apparently believed would end very differently. I felt, hearing all of this, a strange, muted sensation, not quite satisfaction, not quite indifference, something closer to the flat recognition you feel watching weather finally catch up to a storm system you predicted days earlier. I did not gloat. I did not, if I'm honest, feel much of anything specific toward Marcus by that point at all, only a kind of quiet, settled distance, the sense of having closed a file on a project that no longer required my attention. My attention, that spring, was almost entirely elsewhere. I had used part of the acquisition proceeds to do something I had quietly wanted to do for years and never allowed myself to seriously consider while married, funding a small angel investment fund alongside Priya, aimed specifically at women building unglamorous, overlooked businesses in logistics, manufacturing, and supply chain technology, the kind of companies that never make it onto a magazine cover but quietly keep the entire economy moving. I had also, finally, bought myself a small house near the lake, nothing extravagant, just enough space and enough light and enough silence to remember what it felt like to build a life according to my own specifications rather than someone else's assumptions about what I was worth. Standing in that atrium that evening, watching Priya laugh with a cluster of new investors under warm gold lighting, I thought about the version of myself who had sat frozen in a parking garage 11 weeks earlier, unable to make her hands stop shaking, convinced that losing her job meant losing her footing entirely. I thought about how close I had come, in the panic of that first hour, to calling Marcus immediately, to needing him to comfort me, to reaching instinctively for the exact person who had already, quietly, 2 months earlier, begun planning to leave. I understood now, with the particular clarity that only distance provides, that the worst day of my life and the best day of my life had happened within 6 hours of each other, and that for a long, disorienting stretch afterward I had not known which one would end up defining me. Standing there in green silk, glass of wine untouched in my hand, surrounded by people who had believed in something I built with my own 2 hands long before anyone else thought it was worth believing in, I finally understood which one had won. I want to tell you that the months after that party were entirely peaceful, that I never once thought about Marcus again, that closure arrived cleanly and stayed that way. That would not be true, and I think stories like this one do people a disservice when they pretend total transformation happens on a single dramatic afternoon in a conference room. There were nights, plenty of them, when I sat alone in my new house near the lake and felt the specific, hollow ache of a marriage ending, not the ache of missing Marcus exactly, but the ache of missing the version of my life I had assumed I was living, the story I had told myself for 9 years about who my husband was and what our future looked like. Grief doesn't check whether you deserve the outcome you got. It shows up anyway, uninvited, usually around 11 at night when the house is too quiet and the framed photo you haven't taken down yet catches the light a certain way. I let myself feel that grief without rushing to fix it or explain it away, because I had learned, somewhere between the layoff and the mediation table, that pretending to be fine faster than you actually are is just another form of the same performance I had spent 9 years perfecting for a man who was never paying close enough attention to notice the difference. What did change, permanently and completely, was the way I understood my own instincts. I thought back often to that small, stubborn habit I'd maintained for years, quietly declining to add Marcus to my personal accounts, always with some polite, reasonable excuse that even I hadn't fully believed at the time. I used to think of that instinct as a flaw, some private failure of trust one needed to eventually correct. I understand now that it was the opposite, a form of self-respect operating quietly beneath the surface, protecting a version of my future I couldn't yet articulate but somehow already knew I would need intact. I think many of us carry instincts like that, small, quiet, easily dismissed signals that something isn't being reciprocated the way it should be. And I think the real lesson of everything that happened that spring isn't really about revenge at all, however satisfying it felt to watch a bank statement dismantle a man's entire negotiating strategy in real time. The real lesson is about listening to yourself before a crisis forces you to. Marcus spent 2 months quietly preparing an exit strategy while sleeping beside me every night, treating our marriage as a position to be managed rather than a partnership to be honored, and the truth is, looking back with total honesty, there were signs of that shift long before the divorce papers appeared on my counter, signs I had noticed and quietly, deliberately, chosen not to examine too closely because examining them would have required action I wasn't yet ready to take. I don't say that to blame myself for what he did. His choices were entirely his own, made with full knowledge of the damage they would cause, and no amount of my own delayed awareness changes that fundamental fact. But I do think there is something worth sitting within the space between noticing and acting, in the gap where so many of us live for months or years, hoping a quiet discomfort will resolve itself if we simply wait long enough or love hard enough or perform normalcy convincingly enough. It doesn't resolve itself. It waits, patiently, for a moment exactly like the one I lived through that gray Thursday in March, when everything you've been avoiding arrives all at once, on the same morning, whether you're ready for it or not. If there's a single thing I would want anyone listening to this to take from my story, it isn't the number in that bank account, satisfying as it was to watch Marcus's face when he saw it. It's this. Build something of your own, quietly, patiently, entirely on your own terms, even and especially inside a relationship that feels secure, not because you expect it to fail, but because your own competence, your own independent foundation, is never a betrayal of partnership. It's the thing that determines whether you walk into your worst day as a woman who has lost everything, or a woman who discovers, in the middle of the wreckage, that she built herself a floor sturdy enough to stand on regardless of who decided to walk away. I lost my job on a Thursday morning in March. My husband filed for divorce 2 hours later, believing he was striking at the exact moment I would be weakest, most desperate, most willing to accept whatever terms he offered just to feel secure again. He never once imagined that 6 hours after he filed that petition, I would become worth more than his entire firm managed in assets, because he had spent 9 years underestimating the quiet, unglamorous work I did on nights and weekends while he called it my little side project with that small, indulgent smile. I don't think about that smile anymore. I think about the house near the lake, about the fund Priya and I built to back other women doing the unglamorous, overlooked work nobody claps for, about the specific, hard-won silence of a life built entirely on my own terms. Sometimes people ask me, when they hear this story secondhand, whether I regret keeping the company separate for so long, whether a better marriage would have meant sharing everything from the very beginning, no quiet accounts, no unspoken instincts, no careful boundaries drawn without explanation. I used to wonder that too, in the earliest weeks after the settlement, lying awake replaying 9 years of small, reasonable decisions that had somehow, in the end, protected me from a man I never once suspected of needing to be protected against. I don't wonder it anymore. I think a good partnership should never require you to dissolve every boundary you have simply to prove your devotion, and I think the instinct to keep one small, quiet space entirely your own, financially, professionally, emotionally, is not a failure of intimacy but a form of wisdom most of us only recognize in hindsight, usually on the exact morning we finally need it. Marcus taught me that lesson in the cruelest possible way, but he did teach it to me, and I have carried it forward into every decision I've made since, in business, in friendships, in the quiet, deliberate way I now build my life. I still believe in partnership. I still believe in trust, in sharing a life fully with someone who has earned it. But I no longer believe that trust requires the complete erasure of your own independent ground, and I think that distinction, small as it sounds, might be the single most important thing I learned across that entire gray, devastating, ultimately transformative spring, the lesson that quietly building your own foundation is never a betrayal of love, and that the woman who does it in silence, year after year, unnoticed, is usually the one still standing long after everyone else's carefully performed certainty has quietly, completely, irreversibly collapsed around them. If you've ever underestimated your own quiet work, or watched someone else underestimate it right up until the moment it changed everything, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if today's episode reminded you that the version of you building something in the background is never wasting her time, go ahead right now, in this very moment, hit that like button, drop a comment telling me exactly where you're watching from tonight, hit subscribe for more stories exactly like this one, and I'll be right here waiting to tell you the next one.